Hi people, hope you're all well. It's been a little while since I made a video on Ukraine. I think the last one was on that UN Security Council vote. Actually, not UN Security Council, it was the UN General Assembly, I should say. 141 countries called for Russia to withdraw. 36 countries abstained, and only seven supported Russia. Now, this is very important because Russia would want the international community to believe that it's some sort of Western bloc against Russia. But it's quite obvious that that's not the case. Um, this is not to say that there aren't a lot of people being hoodwinked by Russia's lies and propaganda. As I said before, it seems to be permeating in Africa and Asia a lot more than in Europe and North America. Having said that, there is no shortage of Putin apologists in the West as well. Maybe less of them, but they're out there. Um, the latest one I've come across is the Irish MEP Mick Wallace. I wasn't familiar with him before, but he's a classic example of someone who um, regurgitates an anti-West narrative and then tries to claim that he's not pro-Putin when he very clearly is. It's very much the Jeremy Corbyn school of thought, which is to have this knee-jerk opposition to anything that represents the West, whether it be NATO or the European Union or whatever it is. Um, it's wrong, and the adversarial force, in this case Russia, must be right. He's also grotesquely tried to downplay what's happening in China with the Uyghurs. Yeah, Mick Wallace, an Irish, I think he's an independent MEP. Um, and these people, they love to, their supporters tend to see them as truth tellers and, oh, look how radical and different they're being. Really, they're just useful idiots at best. And I suspect it might be worse than that. I think they're quizzlings personally. I have zero respect for such people. I don't think you could show neutrality when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Maybe if you're on the other side of the world and you're quite detached from the situation, but I don't know how any European can show neutrality in this situation. I really don't, because it affects all of us, and that's the whole point about this. Um, and I'm going to open these reflections on the situation with this thought. One of my main concerns, although Ukraine still has, I think, I think their population and their troops definitely have the morale. I think there is a concern that there will be a fatigue in the support. What I mean by that is this war's went on now for 14 months, uh, going from the invasion onwards. And I'm not saying there wasn't trouble before that, there wasn't issues before that, but taking this major conflict from February 2022 to now, 14 months, the longer it goes on, the more that fatigue will increase. It doesn't mean the war's gone away, but we can see this with other conflicts. I mean, after a few years of the war in Syria, that started taking a backtrack in the news. Um, and the Iraq War, after the initial 2003 invasion, then it became kind of Iraq insurgency. The longer a conflict goes on, the further down the news agenda is because that's the way news works. Um, your news is about informing, but there is also motivation to keep people watching and keep people interested. Unfortunately, there's also a rating side to that. So if the news is always Ukraine all the time, people would switch off. So there's that side of it as well. But my concern is that there will be a sort of war fatigue in the West, and people will start openly saying, "Oh, why should we keep supporting the Ukrainians?" And I think that is a very big mistake. And this is why I absolutely believe there is a moral argument for supporting Ukraine. I think it's absolutely the same as um, intervening in World War II. In that sense, I'm not saying this is yet a world war, but I think intervention after Germany invaded Poland was justified, and I think intervention after Russia invaded Ukraine is justified. No two conflicts are exactly the same, but there are definitely echoes of history, no question about it. In the 1930s, Germany was talking about the need to protect German speakers as justification for its process of annexation in the Sudetenland and so on. And likewise, Russia claims it's protecting Russian speakers. One big thing about that is there hasn't been a sort of mass uprising of Russian speakers. A lot of Ukrainians speak Russian. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a sizable portion of the country. But there hasn't been this mass sort of uprising, thanking Russian troops for the liberation. That's a delusion. Um, it hasn't happened. So, to those who say that Russia's sort of intervened to protect Russian speakers, where are all these Russian speakers? Why aren't they welcoming the Russian forces? Granted, in Donetsk and Luhansk, there will be pro-Russian people there. There's evidence has emerged actually of Russian citizens, that is, from the mainland Russian Federation, who've actually come in and settled there. There's some very, very nefarious things that Moscow is doing to shore up its propaganda. Um, but that's my concern that there will be sort of a war fatigue, and the longer this goes on, unfortunately, the conspiracy theorists might get more weight. I'm not saying they're right. I think they're really playing Putin's game, but it will enable them to say, "Oh, can we keep funding Ukraine indefinitely?" And this is Zelensky's war, and so on. I've seen them blame the rising living costs on Ukraine as if a country defending itself is responsible for that. The cost in living is at least partly because of Russia's decision to invade. All of this comes down to Putin's decision. He has caused so much suffering for so many people, millions of Ukrainians certainly, but also Russians. Russian soldiers who basically cannon fodder would be the wrong word today, but tank fodder. Um, and it's you would think that there would be sort of an uprising against Putin for that fact alone, the fact that these soldiers are treated like commodities. I mean, really, I've long believed that being a Russian soldier must be one of the very worst jobs in the world because they're just basically numbers. Putin doesn't care about human life. Like all dictators, he is desensitized to it. Um, so, if a million Russian troops have to die for him to get his irredentist vision, that's a price worth paying. That's the worldview of a tyrant. Um, a total disregard for human life, and you can see this throughout Russian history. Lenin had it, Stalin had it, and now Putin has it. Um, but I think the focus now, of course, is largely on Bakhmut, this town in the east. And the pictures that are coming out of there. At the end of last year, around December, when this particular operation escalated, the Daily Mail had pictures which were showing just how similar this was to the Passchendaele campaign in World War One, and it's incredible. My great uncle actually died in that campaign, specifically at the Battle of Langemarck, August 1917. My great uncle Adam Craig. But the images are striking. Charred trees at Passchendaele, charred trees at Bakhmut, bloodied soldiers at Passchendaele, bloodied soldiers at Bakhmut, and you can find that in any war zone. But the echoes are incredible. And actually, the town of Bakhmut it looks like World War II type devastation. When you had the total scale destruction. So I don't think anyone should be under illusions that what's going on in eastern Ukraine is a total war. It's not a small, um, you know, insurgency or something. It's a total war where both sides really are fighting for the destiny, the future direction of this conflict. Zelensky has spoken about the importance of Bakhmut. I think the only way this conflict ends is with Russian withdrawal. You know, I had a debate with a Vietnamese friend a while back. She said, "Oh well, they need peace. Look how long the Vietnam War went on, if." And then Um, my response to that was, of course, the Ukrainians want peace. I'm sure they're fed up with the war, but if it's choice between peace, being slaves of Russia, or prolonged war of liberation, they're going to choose the latter. What country in the world would just surrender itself? Any peace proposals that have been put forward so far have fallen flat because neither side's going to concede. The Ukrainians are not going to give up the country, and why would they? And Russia's demands that they do as well. Actually, Ukraine's demands are that Russia face a war crimes tribunal before any peace deals are held. Well, that's not going to happen. But whereas Russia's demands is it holds on to the annexed land. The problem is Russia isn't going to stop there, and that's the whole point of this conflict. You know, Russia under Putin doesn't even see Ukraine as a legitimate country. That's something that Putin apologists and those around the world who are sitting on the fence need to understand about this. Russia doesn't even see Ukraine as a sovereign state. I mean, how can that even be a starting point for the Ukrainians when Russia doesn't even see them as basically human? There's a real dehumanization actually of the Ukrainian people. That old saying, when a lie's been told so many times it becomes the truth. Well, Russia's regurgitated the Ukrainian Nazis line so many times that unfortunately some people have picked it up. Now, there will be some far right contingents in Ukraine. I've never disputed that. But there's also far right contingents in Russia. Why do these people who talk about Nazi Ukraine, why do they not talk about white supremacists and neo Nazis who are very active in modern Russia? And they've only been partially banned by the Kremlin. The Kremlin has found them useful on occasion. I have no doubt that they are among the excess ranks now swelling eastern Ukraine. There's the regular Russian army, there's the Wagner thugs, and there's probably all sorts of other unsavory components out there because Putin's a desperate tyrant. So why is Russia not losing? I think the reason is because they do have much more manpower. The Ukrainians, there's a few reasons why Ukraine survived as long as it has. Firstly, it's the astonishing courage of the Ukrainian people and the fact that they haven't given up easily. Um, to use another World War One analogy, it certainly was not over by Christmas. Ukraine's a big country geographically. It's one of the biggest countries in Europe, so it's not an easy country to take over. And of course, it was the scene of some of the fiercest battles of World War Two. The Kiev battles, the Kharkiv battles, the Dnieper offensive. They were some of the most ferocious campaigns of World War Two. Um, and history seems to be repeating itself. It's a total war that's going on out there. No one probably will never know the exact mortality, but I think it's quite plausible that the figures are well in the thousands in the Battle of Bakhmut alone. Given the level of destruction, given the style of warfare, I think it's very plausible. And there is indication that the Battle of Bakhmut is one of the biggest, if not the very biggest, battle of the 21st century, um, which is astonishing. But with it's this constant war of attrition. The Russians get a city or a town, the Ukrainians retake it, the Russians may retake it. It's this constant back and forth. And there are those who say, oh, well, let's stop funding the Ukrainians, that'll end the war. But will it? Will it? Russia will then keep pushing forward. It will take over the whole country. Then there'll be an occupation, and we know what happens in occupations. It happened in Iraq. May as well say it happened in Iraq. And it certainly happened in occupied France, occupied Netherlands, occupied Greece during the Second World War. It didn't end the conflict. Then you have a guerrilla campaign by resistance fighters, and that's what would happen in Ukraine. If Russia took over the whole country and installed a puppet government, there would be a Ukrainian resistance and the war would continue in that sense, as it should, because it's just fundamental human nature that people don't want to be occupied in any situation. So I think that, that's naive, this idea that if we just stop arming Ukraine, the only thing that will happen is Russia will take over, it will win the conflict militarily, the Ukrainians would naturally feel it's a betrayal. Um, and then it would embolden Russia to not stop there. This idea that Russia would just stop at Ukraine, I do believe that Putin is motivated by an irredentist obsession. This thing about protecting Russian speakers is an excuse. It's an irredentist obsession. Putin's famously quoted as saying that the fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. He felt that lots of the Soviet Empire, never mind the Soviet Empire, the Tsarist Empire, which included Ukraine and the Baltic states, he thought was a tragedy. He thought it was a national humiliation. And that's Putin's guiding philosophy, that this is payback somehow for past wrongs as he sees it. So never mind the fact that Ukraine's had a distinctive identity for, not even since independence, it's always had a distinctive identity. Um, That's why I don't use the term Le Ukraine, which is the Russian variation of what they say is the Ukraine region. I talk about Ukraine, sovereign nation of Ukraine. Um, so I think the only way this ends is with Russian withdrawal, something akin the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan or the American withdrawal from Vietnam, which was 50 years ago last week, actually. Um, Only then did those specific conflicts end. Um, I mean, that's the only way this is going to happen. And the danger is obviously Russia is a nuclear state. It may not be a major economic power, but it's still a very powerful country. There's no getting away from that. I reckon it's roughly the third most powerful country in the world after the United States and China. Um, so Russia can never be underestimated. But Putin's obsession may well cost him. There is mounting evidence that this guy, Prigozhin of the Wagner Group, there may be something nefarious going on there. He may be engineering some sort of internal coup. But it's very hard to know to what extent we could give weight to that, because so much of Putin's Russia is you have to take it with a pinch of salt in terms of, like, for example, the idea yesterday a blogger was killed in St. Petersburg. He's been called a blogger, a journalist, but he had a military rank. I have to be honest, I find it hard to have any sympathy with people who are Putin propagandists. I think they've got blood on their hands. Um, the Nazis had them. There's someone who is regurgitating the lies of Putin and knowingly doing it has blood on their hands. So I'm not going to cry crocodile tears and condemn it. Is it the right way to go about it? Other people were injured. I'm not sure that bombing was the right approach. But this is a total war. Now, no doubt the Kremlin will blame Ukrainian special forces or something for that. We'll probably never know for sure. Apparently, a woman's been arrested and confessed. Whether that confession is accurate or not. If she's Russian resistance, all I could say is that some of the bravest people in the world. And I'm just going to close with a thought. Recently I have seen I'm on a number of pro-Ukrainian groups online, and they've been saying things like all Russian athletes should be banned from the Olympics. And I've seen comments like there's no such thing as a good Russian. I think that's wrong. But I say that with the knowledge that I'm not in the shoes of a Ukrainian. When you have total war, when your country has been invaded, when people have been displaced, tortured, killed, um, I think it's natural that Ukrainians would hate all Russians. I'm not saying it's right, because what my response to that is, look, there's Russians who are risking their lives, who are risking long prison terms for standing up to Putin. It's not true that no Russians are taking risks. That it's simply not true. There's Russians that hate this war and are trying to do something about it. And I think the problem with vilifying all Russians is it plays into the Kremlin's hands, because then they can say, well, this is a Russophobic agenda. I do think it's perverse that Russia has got leadership of the UN Security Council at this time. I think that's perverse, and it shows one of the many flaws with the UN. And I can understand Ukraine being furious about that. But I've heard Ukrainians, including Vladimir Klitschko, who I have a lot of respect for, calling for a universal ban on Russian athletes, and I just think that could backfire because, I mean, put it this way: if you have Russian athletes who have worn that ghastly Z symbol, they should definitely be banned. I think the Z symbol should be seen as the same as a swastika. Um, but you know, as I understand that the IOC is allowing Russian athletes to compete under a neutral flag. Now, I think that's reasonable, and I think if the Ukrainians push too hard on that, it's that could actually backfire in terms of international opinion because it could people could say, well, let's just prove to the anti-Russian prejudice that existed in Ukraine, which is what the Kremlin uses as an excuse. So, I'm wary that I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not in their position. And like I say, if this country was occupied and this country was, we were suffering massacres at the hands of an occupying force, I'd probably despise everyone of that occupying force, especially if I'd lost loved ones. So I tread carefully about lecturing Ukrainians on this, but I just think that can backfire. I don't agree with vilifying all Russians, and actually, I think Russian dissidents are some of the bravest people in the world. I do, because they are taking real risks. They can go to prison for years and years. They could be, silenced by Putin's shady forces. It's happened before. The journalist Anna Politkovskaya is one of many examples. So it's not this idea there's no good Russian. It's just, I mean, similar sentiments existed after World War II. There was sort of a mass collective punishment of Germans, and Germans themselves didn't complain much about it or haven't complained much about it because there was this general sense they were the villains of World War II. And there were actually atrocities against ethnic Germans after the war. And even in this country, there was strong, strong anti-German sentiment up to probably at least the 70s by people who remembered the Blitz. And it's fine for people who haven't lived through war to pontificate. So I tread carefully about that. But it's just my personal opinion that it's wrong to vilify all Russians. I think that backfires. So I don't agree with this idea that it's like Russian musicians and others who it's kind of collective punishment. I don't agree with it. I think if they're Putin supporters, I think if they've come out in support of the war, that's a different matter because they're directly supporting the bloodshed. They're directly supporting persecution and the dehumanization of the Ukrainian people. But punishing Russians for no other reason than the passport they hold, I'm not convinced that's correct. Um, Also, the other problem is it polarizes Russians who do want to speak out. Turning against them only makes a difficult situation harder. And I'm not saying it's difficult in the same way as living in a bomb shelter, but it is difficult. They could potentially face years in prison or assassination. But Ukraine must win this war. I think it's the only way it ends, and I think it's the only moral outcome because the alternative for those who are saying there must be peace now, at this point, what that means is the Ukrainians basically giving up their country. That's unconscionable, and no other country in the world would accept that. So I think it's a non-starter. So unfortunately, the war will continue, but it is a war that Ukraine must win, and I think we should continue supporting them. Of course, we should always make sure that we have enough to protect ourselves. That's the absolute priority of any country. I was reading a segment on Anthony Beevor's comprehensive history of World War II, and there was one chapter about the Battle of France and Churchill's negotiations with the French delegations after the fall of France, and um, the divisions in the British cabinet about what would be supporting France, what would support Britain, and so on. So of course, Britain must always come first. That's a prerequisite of any government. But I think we must support the Ukrainians as long as we practically can, because it will not end at Ukraine. That's why the only way this ends is for Russian withdrawal, and hopefully there'll be some sort of internal coup against Putin or some sort of mutiny in the Russian forces. Because there's also significant evidence of
severe tensions between the regular Russian army and the Wagner thugs, which, by the way, I think should be designated a terrorist organization. I don't know why we haven't already done so. It's one of those British things, we leave everything to the last minute. They're a bunch of thugs and they need to be designated a terrorist organization. I'll leave it there.